protests erupted in China last week as hundreds of citizens hit the streets in several Chinese cities to air their frustrations over the Chinese Communist Party's zero COVID policy and their ongoing and total lockdowns. The CCP has a long history of crushing any rebellion, and news reports indicate that such efforts have already begun. But in an era of smartphones, digital recording, and instant communications, could this represent a tipping point? How will the Communist Party deal with this? Joining me now to discuss this is China expert Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and The Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can follow him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Okay, so let me ask you this. The first, in your view, are the CCP's zero tolerance COVID policy, is this here to stay forever?
Maybe not forever, because that's a really, really long time. But for our lifetimes, yeah, it could very well be. The Communist Party has a number of problems. It's lied to the Chinese people, it's lied to the world, and it's now boxed in. So, for instance, it doesn't have an effective way of stopping disease other than isolation. So it's gone to these incredible lengths to, for instance, weld people into their own apartments. And we've seen that with the tragic consequences on Thursday when that apartment burned in Urumqi and firefighters couldn't get to the building because of COVID blockades on the streets, and they couldn't get to people in the apartments because they've been shut in. I think that the Communist Party is using this to control people, and it's not going to give up.
So are you saying that part of this is that they don't have the capacity healthcare-wise and the technology to care for an outbreak such as COVID?
Right. During this 3 years of the pandemic in China, they did not invest in ICU facilities. So they can't just sort of let the wave ride through it and get herd immunity. What they did was they built quarantine facilities by the hundreds of thousands. And so those are not going to be helpful. Really what we've seen in China is putting money in all the wrong things. The other thing about this, Tony, which we often forget, is that the Communist Party, from the early months of the pandemic, tried to weaponize its handling of the disease by saying, look, the low numbers of infections and deaths in China prove the superiority of Chinese communism over American democracy. And so they can't allow any sort of herd immunity because that would raise the numbers and that would threaten Communist Party legitimacy.
But science would tell us, Gordon, that if you don't reach that level of herd immunity, you're never going to get over the hump on this.
Right. You're absolutely right, Tony. But the party right now is stuck. And really, you know, it's fascinating. But over the last week or so, the Chinese people have been watching the World Cup in Qatar. And what they've been taking away is that the Chinese, they say themselves, they're living on another planet because everybody else is running around the world maskless. They don't seem to be dying. And the Chinese Communist Party is enforcing these draconian lockdown rules inside the country that don't seem to be working. And so the Chinese people right now are furious because they realize how counterproductive Communist Party policies are. And now, you know, the CCP is showing World Cup, but it's not showing the crowds in the stands. It's just showing the action on the field.
How significant, Gordon Chang, are these protests that are breaking out all across China?
Long term, I think they're extremely significant and could lead, I believe, to the downfall of the Communist Party. And the reason is that the party right now has lost support throughout society. As a famous China historian said, they've lost people's hearts. This is significant because in 1949, the communists were able to take over China against a superior Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists because the nationalists had lost people's hearts. So, you know, I can't say that this month or next month the Communist Party will fall, but eventually it must, because this is now a struggle between the people and the regime. And there are a lot more people outside the regime than inside.
We've seen how this ended in Hong Kong, the brutal suppression of the people. Should we expect to see the same happen there in the homeland of China?
Yes, absolutely. But the struggle in Hong Kong is not over. The people in Hong Kong are still showing their defiance. Then many of them are just leaving, but nonetheless, we are seeing that people are not putting up with Communist Party rule, whether we're talking Hong Kong or whether we're talking mainland China.
So very quickly, could we see kind of a flare up again in Hong Kong as a result of what's happening in the mainland of China?
We've seen flare ups in Hong Kong in 2003, 2014, 2019. So we can see flare ups there again. And we certainly are going to see flare ups in the mainland because the Communist Party is not letting up and the Chinese people have no place to go. So as we heard those chants over the weekend, they will not accept Communist Party rule. They can be intimidated, they can be coerced, but once they see an opening, they go for it.
Very interesting. We're going to keep our eye very closely on this because I think it's very, very significant what's developing there. Gordon Chang, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tony.